The following presentation is a recording of a webinar presented to NASS staff by Clayton Myers and Seth Wexler of USDA's Office of Pest Management Policy, made on September 3, 2020. OPMP is the agency that has asked for the new questions in Section E1 to be included on both the ARMS Phase 2 Production Practices Report and the Fruit and Vegetable Chemical Use Surveys. These two presenters spend a significant amount of time discussing the ins and outs of each question on the form. However, please note that the audio quality is not the same as the other presentations on this site, as it was recorded from a teleconference line.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks for meeting with us today. We'll hopefully get through these in short order. We appreciate the time. We really appreciate NASS's efforts to add some additional pest management questions on these two surveys. Our office is the Office of Pest Management Policy, and we have a statutory relationship with EPA in terms of getting them data for use in pesticide policy work and for making pesticide label decisions and reevaluation decisions. And one of our primary objectives with them is to get them the best information possible about what growers are doing, what kind of pest management practices they're adopting. And what everyone needs to understand is that this information really helps support the availability of these tools. Many times in EPA's risk assessment processes, their default assumptions are worst-case scenarios for what sort of rates growers use, how often they apply pesticides, what sort of drift profiles are happening, minimal tillage, worst-case assumptions for drift and off-target exposure. And the more information that we can support them, backed by good data about what growers are actually doing on the ground to prevent all of those things, the better understanding they're going to have in terms of making their decisions. And so this is really, while it is a burden to growers to respond to these questions and a burden to enumerators to add these questions onto the additional, in addition to the survey they're already administering, this is hugely valuable information for USDA and EPA to have a real on-the-ground view of the good stewardship practices that growers are already doing so that EPA can kind of take that into account when they make these decisions. And what we've done is we've requested a number of new questions to be added to the 2020 NASS VegChem Use Survey and the 2020 Soybean ARMS Phase 2 Survey. Now, some of you may have been in a similar meeting like this last year where we had similar questions that were added to last year's Fruit Chem Use Survey and the ARMS Wheat Survey. So hopefully it's not too redundant for those of you who participated in that last year, but I know some of you may also be new. And so we really want to walk through a little bit of the reasons why we're asking these questions and walking through some of the specifics so that you can guide the enumerators to get the best responses possible. What these questions will ultimately help USD understand is what growers on the ground are doing in a number of areas. We want to understand what they're doing to reduce off-field pesticide drift. And we also want to know about what participation they have in existing programs to manage drift, existing stewardship programs. We want to know what sort of decision tools that they use, whether it's extension or chemical company information or commercial information in terms of choosing their methods of application or choosing their nozzle setups and calibration setups and how they manage their spray systems. We also want to understand what they're doing in terms of managing pest resistance. As you probably know, when you use pesticides repeatedly, the same mode of action, the target pest can build up resistance to those chemicals. And so chemical rotation or chemical combination or other stewardship efforts around resistance are really important to allow these tools to have some longevity so that we don't burn out all the available tools that we have, but rather we steward them in a way that makes them valuable for years to come and so that pests maintain susceptibility. So what growers are doing around resistance management is hugely important, and it's information that EPA always asks us about. And our office, we have ag backgrounds. We can anecdotally say, oh yeah, we know most growers are doing low-till, we know most growers are doing crop rotation, we know growers of certain crops are doing this specific chemical rotation, but anecdotal information only goes so far, and when we have really high-quality data backed by NASS in terms of, your excellent survey frame that you pull from and the methodology that's well known for administering these surveys, that's hugely valuable data. That's data that EPA can rely on and point to and say, look, we have high confidence that this data reflects grower practices as opposed to anecdotal information. So that's really the crux of why we're adding these questions and why we're so thankful for NASS's assistance in helping us to get this information. So a couple things that are important in terms of guidance for your enumerators. As with all these surveys, of course, we want to ensure the respondents that they're protected by confidentiality. They needn't fear that the information they divulge is going to be used against them in any specific way. This is not an enforcement-related effort whatsoever. This is strictly to help EPA have the best available data possible for them to best understand what growers are actually doing, and so that they can make decisions and make label and registration decisions that make sense. We want label statements to not be stupid. We want label statements to be intuitive and understandable to growers and to reflect the practices that they're familiar with and what they're doing. And so, that confidentiality is key. We need to reinforce and assure growers that this information is going to help them, not hurt them. And we also want to assure them that for a number of these questions, an answer or response of "I don't know" is perfectly acceptable. That's hugely valuable information to us, especially in terms of communication tools and outreach efforts. EPA or terminology, right? We don't want EPA applying terminology on the labels that growers don't understand or don't comprehend because they use different terminology. And so I don't know is just as valuable an answer as any of the other responses, and sometimes can be the most important information that we get. Because if it leads to EPA tailoring an outreach plan that's driven by a different source or a different way of explaining things or a different way of conveying information that is going to click better with growers, that's all to the better. So we don't want growers to guess. We don't want growers to give us answers that they think we want to hear. We want them to answer honestly, a reflection of their actual practices. And when they don't know or something doesn't apply or they're just not familiar with something, we perfectly fine to respond as such, and that's what we want. Another common area of confusion with pesticide surveys, you may run into this already, is that some growers use the term pesticide just to refer to insecticides, just for bug-killing materials. When EPA uses pesticides and when USDA uses that term, we use the SIFR definition, which is all-encompassing. A pesticide can refer to insecticides, miticides, fungicides, herbicides, nematicides, and plant growth regulators, also bactericides. So when we use that terminology, you may have to reiterate this a couple times over the course of the survey, because growers will revert to this. They'll say, oh, well, for my herbicide applications I did this, but for my pesticide applications I did something else. And what we need to capture is what they're doing for all of those things. And there are instances where we may break out herbicides versus fungicides and insecticides specifically, and you'll see that in some of the questions. But generally speaking, when we're asking about pesticides, they need to understand that includes herbicides, that includes fungicides and plant growth regulators. What it doesn't include is vertebrate control. We're not asking questions about mouse bait or granular, bird repellents or other kind of mammalian or vertebrate pest tools that are used. We're talking about mainly foliar or soil-applied sprays for diseases, insects, weeds, etc. And so with that, we wanted to walk through some of the new questions. Some of them are going to line up a little bit between soybeans and veg chem. So we're really looking to cover both surveys today. We hope that doesn't waste too many people's time because we know some enumerators maybe will only administer soybeans and others may only administer veg and some will administer both. But we felt for the best use of time, it just made sense to run through everything. And there are some areas where we'll show some of the contrasts between the two. And so I will turn it over to Seth to help us kick off, I guess.
Good afternoon and or morning to all of you. My name is Seth Wexler. Like Clayton, I'm a staff member in the Office of Pest Management Practices. I've been an economist with USDA for about 6 years now. I can tell you a little bit about my prior experience and focuses. They've largely been in the economics of pest management and the impacts of genetically engineered crops with pest management traits, the evolution of resistance in pest populations, and of course trends in farmers' pesticide use. So admittedly, I don't have much experience with the ARMS PPR, but these types of questions and these types of issues have been a focus of my career up to this point. And I do have some experience with the ARMS PPCR. which is the more research-oriented version of this questionnaire. So this is the first time I've been, conducting a training remotely. You'll have with me. Back in 2016, I did participate in some enumerator training with staff from the NASS Northwest Region Office. I suspect this isn't going to be quite as much fun, but we'll do our best to keep it lighthearted and succinct. So, we'll start by discussing some pesticide spraying activities. What we're trying to understand when we ask this question is what practices growers are using to get pesticide applications on target and to reduce drift. We're also trying to understand how costly and difficult to use these practices are. I do have some good news and some bad news for all of you. The good news is that if, a grower didn't apply any pesticides at all, they can skip the vast majority of these questions. The bad news, at least, in the case of soybeans, is that the vast majority of the growers that you talk to will have sprayed, pesticides. Well over 90% of soybeans are genetically engineered to be tolerant of various types of herbicides, including glyphosate, glufosinate, and dicamba. I suspect you're not going to have the opportunity to skip very much of this. All right, well, best place to start is probably the beginning. We're going to start with items 1 on the Soybeans and Veg Chem survey. So what you should see in front of you at this point is a snapshot of item 1 on soybeans. And you're going to see a whole bunch of different columns at the top of the questionnaire. And, that's where we're going to, kind of like the types of information that you'll be gathering. And in the rows, you're going to see a variety of different drift-reducing practices. And we're going to come back to item 1A shortly, but we're going to start by discussing what we've got in these columns here. So in column 1, we're basically just asking about whether or not the practice was used in 2020. This should be fairly cut and dry. You're either going to code this yes or no. There may be some small percentage of farmers that don't know, and it's okay for them to respond that way, and you should code it that way if they can't answer the question. All right, in column 2, we're going to be asking specifically about whether a practice was used to control drift. There's obviously a lot of different reasons that a farmer might use a practice, but we're really explicitly interested in those that farmers are using to reduce the possibility of off-target movement. You might be wondering, what off-target movement is. Well, off-target movement of a pesticide, can typically will either be referred to as drift, and that's when an application, or droplets move off target, usually, around the time of application, and it's usually wind which is blowing the droplets around and causing them to, not hit the weeds, which is where we want them to go. The other term that you might hear might be volatilization. And this is just a term that is referred to applications that might volatilize or evaporate. Usually this will be after application. It can happen when it's very warm outside. The pesticide can actually evaporate, move up into the air column, and then move hundreds or thousands of feet off target. So that's what we'll be referring to, when we mean on target. On target is hitting the weeds and staying on the weeds, and off target movement is, referring either to drift or this volatilization. Next slide.
And Seth, one thing I'll just chime in and add here is this column is really all about intent. So column 1 is, are they doing the practice or not? For column 2, are you doing this to reduce drift? Or in some cases, they might not be doing it to reduce drift. They might have some other reason for the practice, and that's fine. And that's why they would answer no. But really, what we're looking for is intent here, and whether growers are intentionally doing all these practices to reduce drift.
Yep, that's a great point, Clayton, and definitely worth emphasis. in column 3, what we're asking about here, what we really want to get at is, how costly practice was. You might ask, we're framing everything in terms of how difficult or easy a practice is to implement. Why are we doing that? Well, that's because this is the PPR, the Production Practices Report. If we were adding questions to the Production Practices and Cost Report, we could explicitly ask about costs, but we didn't add questions to that survey, and so we're going to stay a little more general. As you go about coding this question, you'll know that one, could refer to something which is, very easy and not very costly. 4 will refer to something which is quite costly and very difficult to implement. For column 4, here we're going to be asking about, why a practice or activity wasn't used. There might be lots of reasons why a grower chooses not to use a practice. You should code more than one of these responses if more than one is, pertinent. And of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a grower having deemed a practice unnecessary. If that's the case, you can code this option 6 and write in that response or any other that seems appropriate. All right. So let's go back to 1A. So in this question, we're specifically interested in changes in applications that stem from weather conditions that might be unfavorable or or could induce drift or off-target movement if an application was made. These could be things like temperature inversions, when really cold air is trapped under warm air. That typically happens in mornings. It might be very hot outside, or it could just be particularly windy. So in any of these cases, a farmer, could have and probably should have postponed an application, and that's what we're looking to gather information about here. In 1B, we're asking about adjuvants. And an adjuvant is basically any additive that's added to a pesticide that can enhance that pesticide's performance. There are lots of different types of adjuvants. Some of them help pesticides be absorbed by plants or help pesticides stick to plant surfaces, or they can even slow pesticide degradation. Here, we're specifically interested in drift-reducing adjuvants in particular, and only drift-reducing adjuvants. So just be conscious of that as you are coding the question or as you're training your enumerators. And we're also only interested in adjuvants which have been added separately to the spray solution. Okay, so in 1C, we're asking about drift-reducing nozzles. Sprayer nozzles can affect the droplet size of site applications. As you might expect, large droplets are much less likely to drift or move off target than the finer ones are. You might be wondering which nozzle are drift reducing and which are not. Farmers might also, might not know. And for that reason, we've added a list of, drift-reducing nozzle brands in the enumerator's manual. And, farmers can be helped to determine, they're very likely to know, what type of nozzle they're using, and may or may not know whether it's effective at reducing drift. But you can know by checking the interviewer's manual. Item 1D is referring to increases in, the gallons per hour, the spray pressure. And growers typically, might increase gallons per acre because they're going to get better coverage, and that's going to provide them more flexibility with nozzle choice and droplet size, and generally just give them better control of an application. Uh, 1B and 1F are questions about calibration. And calibration is a really important practice. It's key to ensuring that growers actually apply the rates that they think they're applying. information on calibration for some obvious reasons. The grower could be making every effort to follow a label, but still get some type of off-target movement of an application if her or his sprayer isn't working properly and it hasn't been calibrated. I'm going to skip around a little bit here and go to 1I. This is a question about shielded or hooded sprayers. And we've got some pictures of those here on the presentation. These are basically spray shields that can, reduce the potential for an application to drift and move off target, and in that manner. And these are some cool-looking pieces of equipment. And next, we're going to have some questions, precision ag-focused questions. They're a little different on the veg chem portion of the survey than on the soybean portion of the survey. So I'm going to turn the presentation back over to my colleague, Clayton.
Thanks, Seth. And yeah, as we go through these, like I said, there's some contrast. Not all these practices are going to line up exactly between soybean and veg chem. This one is a little more specific because electronic eyes and infrared technology has to do with canopy presence. And so this is really common in orchard sprays where you have an air blast sprayer that can turn off in between trees. But there's similar technology for ground boom applications to vegetables as well, especially if you have cabbage or certain crops that are a little bit more spread out, or sweet corn where you'll have a gap in a row or something like that. There's sensor-based technologies that can turn off the nozzles when you hit an empty spot, and that certainly prevents minimizes drift. So for 1E and 1F, 1F is more like GPS-based. Some people have GPS systems that, with auto steer and turning off on and off nozzles based on a pre-programmed map sort of situation. So that's what we're trying to get at with those. That's going to vary heavily by crop. There may be some vegetable crops where growers not even going to know what you're talking about with these. Other crops are going to say, oh, yeah, sure, I do that for everything. And that is one of the challenges with veg chem especially, is just the diversity of crops that we're talking about. But that's what these two technologies generally refer to. And then pulse width modulation. This is actually more common for agronomic crops, and maybe more common for soybeans than veg chem. But this is technology that compensates for when you hit bumps in the field or change the tractor speed or boom speed. So on a turn, the boom will automatically spit out more water to compensate for the faster travel speed to still deliver the same volume per acre. And this can oftentimes be done by varying pressure on the fly via a computer system. And there are some examples including Aim Command, Hawkeye, Exact Apply. There again, some growers may have never heard of this, and that's fine. But for growers who are using it, it's definitely good for us to understand it and get it sense of who's using it. And then for sprayer recalibration, so if you remember a couple of questions up in question 1, there was a question about whether they calibrate at the beginning of the season or, again, recalibrate during the season. So this is a follow-up. For soybeans, it's going to be question 5. For veg chem, it's question 2. But sort of what are the reasons that what are the things that caused you to have to recalibrate a sprayer in the season? And so if they answer no to those calibration questions, this will be none of the above. If they have an answer for this, but answered no to the calibration question in question 1, you should probably go back and fix that. And there's error reporting that we set up in the specs to handle that. But this really is sort of like, okay, when you recalibrate, is it because you have a computer alert system that tells you your settings have shifted? Or maybe you recalibrate based on a change in a product, so you have a different setup for fungicides versus herbicides on the same sprayer. Or you might just visually observe things like the spray pattern is off, this bloom is clearly putting out more water, and there's a nozzle worn out. Some growers may also just stick to a calendar schedule and recalibrate every 2 weeks or every month or something like that. Some may calibrate based on a crop change, so they'll have a different setup for sweet corn versus cabbage, or a different setup for soybeans versus vegetables. So those are just a number of options we gave for why a recalibration might happen, and of course none of the above is also perfectly acceptable or an other that you can specify and fill in. So we're going to stick with a few more veg chem specific questions. We were certainly interested in what methods of spraying the operator uses. So in this case, we're not talking about herbicides, but for insecticides, fungicides, nematicides, PGRs. We're asking if they use ground boom sprayers, aerial applications, spot treatments, which would be like hand applications with a backpack, chemigation, where they apply their insecticide through a drip line or overhead pivot, or micro sprinklers, air blast or air assisted. Air blast sprayers are very common in orchards, but we actually found in testing that some vegetable growers that have tree crops will also use air blast sprayers to spray their vegetables because they can orient the nozzles downward. We found this to be common in Georgia, where growers might have peaches or pecans that they'll treat with an air blast sprayer, and then to spray squash or cabbage or something else, they can change the settings on their air blast sprayer and use that. But this can also refer to air-assisted ground boom sprayers. So if you remember that picture of the shielded sprayer that Seth showed, some of those actually have air assist setups where there's an intake fan that shunts air through the chutes out by the nozzles and forces that spray down into the vegetable canopy. So if growers are using either of those, that's what we want to capture here. And that's going to be important because, as you'll see, we're going to then split some of the questions based upon this different technology. So for items 4 and 5 in VegChem, we're going to ask a lot about different spray decisions for their different spray rigs. So we would have 2 columns, one for their air-assisted or air blast application systems, and another one for their just regular conventional standard ground booms. And so in this case, in Table 1, I think it's pretty straightforward to go row by row. When we got to these columns, we found it was actually better to go column by column and answer all the questions rather than switching back and forth between sprayer types. It just went faster in testing. And, of course, if a grower doesn't use air-assisted or air blast, then none of that column applies anyway. You can just go through the ground boom. So the first question in this set is just asking about what pesticide types. So, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, bactericides, nematicides, and PGRs for both systems. Here we ask about typical spray volume per acre, gallons per acre. Hopefully straightforward checklist here. We tried to get ranges that make sense. Ultimately, less than 25 GPA for an air-assisted system, less than 5 for a standard ground boom seem to play out to be the most common, or the best place for a cutoff, but we'll continue to improve these over time. There again, they're hopefully straightforward, and what we're asking is the typical. We know growers have all sorts of setups, but what is the most typical for making these sprays is really what we're driving at, because that's what EPA is most interested in, not what the 99th percentile of what's possible. We really want to understand what's most typical for most growers. And what's so great about this survey is that we can break it down by crop, or break it down by state for their purposes. Typical operating pressure. Here again, we think this made sense to most growers we talked to have these different breakdowns of pressure in pounds per square inch. Typical nozzle. So here, this is similar to what we asked in soybean about nozzle types, or what we're going to ask in soybeans about nozzle type, but here, again, they may have totally different nozzles for an air-assisted system versus a standard ground boom system. And similarly, in the IM, we're going to include some of these different charts to show some of the different most typical types. We found that hollow cone was by far the most common for vegetables, but flat fan and full cone can also be used for different applications, so we still wanted to include that. And notice that was not a question about drift reduction. That's just a question about simple nozzle types, because that's good information for EPA to have. If they can narrow down their label verbiage, knowing that 99% of growers use a hollow cone nozzle for vegetables, that can really simplify things if they start to specify drift parameters on a label. Application ground speed, again, pretty straightforward. This is in miles per hour for the different setups. Typical boom height, application height. For pre-emergent applications where you're talking just an application before the crop is planted, this would be distance above the soil. For post-emergence, where you're making a foliar application to a crop, we're asking about distance above the crop canopy. But most growers had no problem at all with this. Now this, target droplet size, is something that in testing the growers had a lot of problems with. But this is a perfect example of where the I don't know response can be very, very useful to us and to EPA. EPA sometimes will specify on labels, we want you to use nozzles that deliver a medium to coarse droplet size spectrum. If the growers don't understand that, or don't have an awareness of how their nozzle choices match up with that, then that's a bad choice by EPA to make that kind of verbiage. And so this is exactly the kind of information that can be very helpful. I'll tell you, based on our testing results, at least when I did this for VegChem, very few growers had a sense of the droplet size spectrum in microns. Some of them had a sense of the droplet size spectrum, in terms of fine, coarse, medium, very coarse, but not everyone. And so, to reiterate, I don't know is a perfectly acceptable and valid answer for this. We don't want them to guess. Here's a question, row H. This is specific to air-assisted systems, so we grade out the ground room system. We just ask reasons why they may change their fan speed. There's all sorts of reasons why you might have to change fan speed because of the crop density or the canopy density, using a different product, especially if you're using a plant growth regulator where foliar coverage and uptake is critical. You might have a whole different setup than, say, applying a herbicide between the rows. So those are the options we presented there. And again, if they're not using air-assisted sprayers, you would be skipping this whole column, so it's a moot point. And here we're asking about drift reduction practices. Again, getting at the same information as we asked in soybeans, but it's laid out differently because we have the two types of application systems, air-assisted and regular ground room. So we're asking if they're using any of the following, like the drift-reducing adjuvants, the drift-reducing nozzles, or the shielded sprayers. And so now we're going to get to some spray decisions, questions tailored to soybeans, which can have much more of a difference between pre-emergent and post-emergent. And as Seth goes through these, hopefully it becomes a little clear why we would ask for those different sets.
Okay, thanks, Clayton. Well, if you take a look at these questions, you can see that we're asking about spray decisions in items 2, 3, and 4 on the soybean survey. And you'll immediately notice that, we're different. There's two different types of information we're differentiating between when it comes to these questions. Now, in item 2, we're asking about pre-emergent applications. And in items 2 and 3, we're asking about post-emergent applications. Now, that's the first distinction, the distinction between pre and post. The second distinction is between herbicides and then, of course, insecticides and fungicides. Why don't we start by discussing what pre- and post-emergent applications are? Next slide. Generally speaking, and this should be pretty, intuitive, a pre-emergent pesticide application is going to be an application which is made prior to the soybean seedling emerging from the soil. A post-emergent application is going to be a later season application, and it's going to be, once the seedling has emerged from the ground and it's starting to grow. So the reason why we want to differentiate between pre- and post-emergent applications is because an off-target application can't hurt a soybean which is still under the ground. So that's largely why we're focused on the difference between pre and post. If you take a look at items 3 and 4, you'll have to remember Clayton explicitly mentioned that we're really interested in typical applications. Well, the typical herbicide application can look really different in terms of droplet size and spray pressure than the typical insecticide or fungicide application. Moreover, just in terms of differentiating between these herbicides and insecticides or fungicides, there are a lot of reasons for soybean growers to be really focused on herbicide use these days. You may have heard of the popular and fairly ubiquitous herbicidal active ingredient glyphosate. Well, there's been an awful lot of development of glyphosate-resistant weeds throughout soybean growing areas, and in the United States and also globally. So recently there have been some new herbicidal active ingredients which have been registered for post-emergent use. Glufosinate is an old one. A newer one would be dicamba, which you'll often hear growers refer to by its trade name as Extend. We can talk a little more about that when we get to our resistance management slide, but that should give you a general sense of why we're differentiating between pre and post, and herbicides and insecticides or fungicides. Here we're going to talk about some spray equipment maintenance. Again, these questions are a little different for soybeans and veg chem. So to handle some of the veg chem stuff, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Clayton.
Sure. So as we discussed previously, there can be a big difference in equipment maintenance practices for an air-assisted system versus a standard ground boom. And both could be used depending on the type of crop they're growing and what sort of active ingredient they're applying. And so similar to what we discussed before, we think it's probably easiest to go through these column by column rather than row by row. All the air blast, air-assisted questions, and then all the ground boom questions. So our first set is about cleaning. How often did the operation clean the system? This is really good. This is just a question of general stewardship. It's very similar to calibration. How diligent are growers about cleaning out their systems to avoid cross-contamination? So we ask, do you clean before the season, after the season? Does it depend on what products you're using? Some growers who may grow both conventional and organic produce may have to switch between those blocks. Some have a regularly scheduled cleaning, like once a week. Some people may clean every single time they use the system. That certainly would be ideal. But we're trying to get a sense of what their practices are. And then for each time you're cleaning, how often was it a tank cleaner used? And this could be as simple as soap or ammonia. There's lots of tank cleaners that are sold specifically for that purpose, but regular old Dawn dish soap is pretty commonly used too, and that definitely counts as a cleaner. It's effective. And these are on the spectrum of always, often, sometimes, never. Pretty straightforward. Here we want to know if they have a separate herbicide rig. This came up pretty commonly. A lot of times, especially when growers are rushed to get in lots of applications, or just don't have the practical means to do as good a job cleaning a system after a herbicide as they would like. Some growers just reserve a whole spray setup for herbicides only and use a different spray rig for their fungicides and insecticides. So that's a straightforward yes, no, and again, broken down between air-assisted and standard ground. Here we're asking about reasons for changing nozzles. This gets a little bit of calibration problems, but we want to sort of understand what it is that drives growers' practices. So we're talking about nozzles being changed just on a regular calendar basis, like once a year, once a month, or maybe a replacement based on tractor or sprayer operating time. If you have a sprayer that logs hours, that can be a handy way to say, yeah, I'm going to change nozzles every 200 hours of operation or something like that. Sporadic replacement could be just based on, a change in the area that you're covering, like sensing that your calibration is off, or maybe just an intuitive sense that something's not quite right. Or explicitly a calibration problem that you can measure. Too high or too low flow rate might drive a nozzle change. Observed nozzle damage is very common. You'll be going through a field and look back and can see a change in the spray pattern, or something's throwing out droplets that are way bigger, or you even have like a hose or something going, full flow of like a steady stream of insecticide instead of a spray pattern. Some may change it based on availability of new technology. They want to try a new nozzle type they haven't tried before and see how that works. And finally, some might go based on, expert recommendations. If the extension agent recommends changing before the season or changing based on a specific product or something like that. So that's a long list of things that we're just curious what drives their decision. And I'll hand it back to Seth now, who's going to go through a lot of similar questions for soybeans, just laid out a little bit differently and formatted differently.
Okay, thanks very much, Clayton. Yeah, like Clayton said, these questions are pretty similar for soybeans and the Veg Chem survey. The reason that we're interested in this information is exactly the same. The unintended mixing or contamination of pesticides can have unintended consequences, and one of those consequences is, can be higher volatility. Higher volatility increases the potential for off-target movement, as we discussed earlier. Take a look at this enumerator note in the middle of your screen. This is another one of those good news, bad news cases. The good news is that it's much more likely for a grower not to have cleaned their sprayer tank than it is for them not to have used pesticides. The bad news is that you only get to skip items A and B here, and that's not going to, save enumerators an awful lot of time. Next slide. So in item 7, we're talking about nozzle types. We already talked about the role of nozzles in controlling droplet size a bit earlier in the presentation. The important thing for you to know is that, nozzles, just like anything else, can get old. And when they get old, they don't work as well. For instance, if you've got like a ceramic nozzle, which, gets old, typically see an increased flow rate. And that can have some ramifications for drift and off-target movement. So that's why we're asking about the material that the nozzle is made from. Let's go on to some questions about windbreaks. All right, great. Windbreaks, like hedgerows, don't affect the possibility of drift, but they can reduce damages from it, either by acting as a natural inter- or intrafield barrier. I should draw your attention to some differences between this question on VegChem and soybean survey. Notice that on number 7, which is the VegChem version of this question, we're talking about a proportion of fields. Let's go on to the next. Take a look at item 9 from the soybean survey. Now, on this question, we're talking about the selected field. So, as staff are looking through these 2 different surveys, I know these questions work really similar, but there are some minor differences between them.
All right. Okay. And then to tie things up, we're really interested in some of the information sources that growers are using to make some of these decisions, whether it's drift, resistance management, or pollinator questions. We're going to get to those in a bit. But we really, this is the crux. This is a hugely valuable piece of information to EPA, because oftentimes things that they want to convey to growers don't come on pesticide labels, and they want other outlets to say, here's a stewardship plan for reducing herbicide drift in soybeans. These questions directly answer what's the best way to reach growers. And it may vary by area. It may be that West Coast growers are more apt to go to extension meetings in person, whereas Southern growers are more apt to sign up for an extension newsletter or talk to their independent crop consultants. And so we really find this to be super important. And we hope that all the growers are going to at least be familiar with these different sources, even if they don't use them. So we want to understand whether growers are reading pesticide product labels. That one I can tell you from testing, every grower is going to say yes, because they know it's the law. They're supposed to read the pesticide label. And, we'd like to think almost all of them are most of the time. University or cooperative extension recommendations. Non-university literature, there's lots of that out there in terms of like commodity trade magazines and catalogs and advertisements, even newspaper articles. Commodity or trade groups. American Soybean Association is a prime example for soybeans. A lot of the vegetable growers have state-level organizations that sometimes put out information about best practices. Pesticide sales representatives, independent crop consultants employed by pesticide companies. Those are 2 very different things. In the case of an independent crop consultant, that's where a grower pays a consultant for his service, his or her service, and they'll write a prescription for what they think the field needs in terms of the pest management. And the onus is on them to do the best job for the grower. Whereas consultants who work for the pesticide companies, they often, they earn a salary based on the commission of what they sell. And it's not that they have bad information, it's just they have a little bit different incentive. And so growers kind of take that information with a certain grain of salt and understand that incentive and price it into their decision. But we want to understand who growers are talking to and where they're getting their information. And of course, we know growers also talk to their neighbors, other growers, and they use other commercial and non-university decision tools. Weather forecasting tools is another very common. And I'm sorry, it looks like part of these have gotten cut off, so there are other options that maybe weren't showing up on the screen. Then we want to dig to within university sources themselves, because we know cooperative extension is a hugely important resource nationally. But what types of information or what types of formats do they use from within these university sources? So are growers going to formal presentations such as annual meetings or twilight meetings or educational training seminars? Are they attending field days or demonstration workshops at university research stations? Are they getting one-on-one consultation with an extension agent? That happens in a lot of areas that are more rural, where it makes more sense for the extension folks to kind of ride a circuit and visit their folks out in the field? Do they subscribe to email listservs or get newsletters through the mail? Some of them may use a crop or pest protection handbook published by the university, like the Vegetable Production Guide for Georgia or the Vegetable Production Guide for the Pacific Northwest. Other publications, such as fact sheets that the extension folks put out, and other decision tools. So these might be things like an economic threshold, like spray for aphids after you see more than 10 aphids per plant or something like that. Hugely valuable information, again, for both soybeans and veg chem, just to understand where growers are getting their information from so that we can target it in the best way to get it to them. Then we also wanted to ask them about resistance management practices. This is a huge concern at EPA. We want to maintain the viability of these tools for a long time. We don't, for so long, growers have gotten in the cycle of, well, if we burn out this mode of action, chemical company will develop a new one. And for decades, they got away with that. But that's not the case anymore. The R&D pipelines in a lot of these companies are not what they used to be. And resistance management is a really acute problem, especially when you have pest species that are resistant to 3, 4, or 5 different modes of action already, and you're running out of weapons that are going to be effective. So we really want to get a sense of what growers understand about resistance and what they're doing to forestall resistance. And this table is split out by pesticide type because resistance management tactics vary so much by target wet pests. So the tactics that you use for resistant weeds are not going to be the same tactics that you use for resistant insects or resistant diseases. And so we definitely found through testing that this was one that made sense to go column by column instead of row by row. Run through all the questions for herbicides, all the questions for fungicides, all the questions for insecticides. And I think as you go through them, it'll become intuitive. We found that once the growers, they might have gotten off to a slow start with this, but once they got rolling, they got what we were going for, and were able to work through the table decently quickly. So we want to ask about scouting. Most growers are doing this in some form or fashion. They're not just spraying by the calendar, but because it's a full moon. It's too expensive to do that. They're going to be spraying because they have a target pest that needs taken care of. Or they have a site history where they know a target pest is going to emerge because it always has for the last 20 years. It's not going out in the blind. So scouting is a very common practice we want to ask about. And again, all these are on the same spectrum, always, often, sometimes, never. And don't know is perfectly fine. But because there are some differences between weeds and fungicides and insecticides, you'll see some of the boxes as we go along are grayed out because it doesn't apply. So the second tactic is field mapping. This is really more common for weeds, but can be done for disease. Certainly with soybeans, when they harvest, they can develop maps based on the GPS setup on the combine that can then give them insights as to where bad spots are in the field the following season. That may have more to do with nutrients than pesticides, but some growers do this for pesticides. So if they're doing it, we'd like to know about it. If they're not doing it, we'd like to know that as well. Field sanitation practices here, these are, as you can see, very specific for each type. For weed control, we're really talking about tillage, management of field-to-field transfer. In some cases, with harvesters, they'll have seed crushers that can be mounted onto the combine to prevent weed seed from going back into the field. For disease and insects, it's much more about inoculum. So we're asking if they're, like for vegetables, it's very common after harvest to till in all that residue rather than let it on the surface so that it doesn't develop as a festering source of disease inoculum or pest pressure. Diamondback moths and cabbage are notorious for that. As soon as you harvest your cabbage, you want to disc it into the ground so you don't have a feeding source for diamondback moth to maintain an established population. So we think growers are going to be pretty familiar with that. Planting disease-resistant cultivars. This can apply to certain vegetables that may have resistance to different fungi. That only applies to the fungicide case. Use of pest diagnostic tools. So this really doesn't have anything to do with weeds. They're not as much based on thresholds. It's just whether they're there or not. Whereas fungicides and insecticides, like for fungicides, you may have a weather model that says, okay, after so many wetting hours, you need to cover up to protect from this disease. Or for insects, if you have so many degree days after the first moth capture, you know that that's when the flight's going to be starting and the pest is going to be laying eggs, and that's your application window. Really important IPM practice. So curious what sort of adoption they're doing. And that's important to resistance management because the timing is critical to control. If you're mistiming it and only kill half the population and you're exposing the rest of that population to some sublethal dose, that's going to hasten the development of resistance to that chemical. You want to hit them with the right chemical at the right time, not just for good IPM, but also for resistance management. Pesticide mode of action rotation is very common. And there are two questions back to back. One is rotation and one is combination. And we ask those separately because they're two very different things. Rotation has to do with changing the product from application to application. So say for first generation Diamondback moth, you'll use a diamide, but for second generation you'll use spinetoram or something totally different. Combination is different. That has to do with the tank mix where you're actually giving them two active ingredients in the same spray. And so two very different tactics, and we'd like to know how commonly they're making use of those. Tank mixing, much more common for herbicides and fungicides, whereas rotation is typically more common for insecticides. And then, of course, rotating crops. Anytime you can break the life cycle of some of these pests and reduce the populations that you have to control chemically, that aids in resistance management as well. And we find crop rotation pretty common. You may have some soybean growers in the Midwest that plant beans after beans year after year, or corn after corn repeatedly. But a good number of growers are doing some kind of crop rotation out of necessity. And then really what we have for soybeans is very similar to what we had for veg chem. Seth may want to comment again. He mentioned a little bit earlier some of the resistance concerns.
I won't belabor the point. The important thing for all of you to know, I suppose, is that this is a really great year to be asking questions about soybeans, and it's really great that we're going to be asking questions about cotton next year. I can provide a little bit of background information about the glyphosate resistance issue, which is an issue affecting growers' herbicide use decisions. Just because I think that'll be particularly forefront in the minds of the soybean growers. Here's just a small amount of context. Herbicide-tolerant crops, which have been genetically engineered to be tolerant of the herbicide glyphosate, were commercialized back in 1996. Adoption rates of these crops increased very quickly in the years that followed. And that's in part because glyphosate is a really great solution for really all field crop producers. It has a very low acute toxicity, incredibly broad spectrum. It's very effective, and it's certainly quite a bit less toxic, insofar as human health and the environment are concerned, than the alternatives. This chemical has in many ways become. I'm sorry, Clayton.
No, I didn't say anything.
Oh, sorry, it must have been a little echo. In some ways, I think this herbicide's become a victim of its own success. Farmers became so reliant on it, it was so ubiquitous over the course of the last 2 decades, that weeds have evolved resistance to the chemical. So in soybeans, there now are some alternatives for post-emergent late-season control. Glufosinate been around for a real long time, but back in 2006, that's the product Liberty. But back in 2016, they commercialized Extend, brand crops, which are tolerant to the active ingredient dicamba. I don't think that Enlist soybeans have been commercialized for large-scale use yet, although this might be the first season that they're in usage. And that's going to provide post-emergent late-season control with 2,4-D. So all these issues are really on soybean growers' minds. There's been regulatory action, which has affected future use of dicamba-based products. And, so it couldn't be more timely that you're asking questions about soybeans. And I think we should get some really interesting information out of this survey. So thanks again for all you're doing to help us get good information.
Thanks, Seth. And to tie things up, we're getting into some best management practices around pollinator protection. As you know, pollinators are a controversial issue, always on EPA's mind. And so we want to get a good understanding, first of all, of what growers are aware of, and then what they're actually doing on their farm to protect bees. So in terms of communications, we want to ask if growers are communicating with a number of sources about bee protection. and what they're aware of. So we want to know if they're talking to their neighboring crop producers, if they're talking to nearby beekeepers, maybe they're talking to their local extension agents. Then there are two specific things, state-managed pollinator protection plans. These have to do with some states are setting up bee registries where a grower and a beekeeper can see where each other are, and a grower can check this before he makes a spray application and say, okay, it looks like hives have been placed within 500 meters of somewhere. I want to make an application later this week. That gives them an opportunity to reach out to the beekeeper, ask them to move them or cover them or just make them aware of what's going on. Drift Watch is a similar tool that's more common in California. I will say that for these two, it's going to vary, I think, a lot by state. When we tested this question in the South, in Georgia, nobody knew about MP3s, nobody knew about Drift Watch, but in Mississippi, everyone's going to know about the MP3 there. A lot of the cotton producers down there use it, and they have a pretty robust mapping tool for beekeepers to register and show where they're located. So totally fine for them to say no. Here again, we want to understand what they're aware of and what they're not aware of and how that varies nationally. And then we want to ask them sort of what they're doing about bloom time applications or about bee protection and what tactics they're using to avoid bee exposure. I'll say up front, this is going to vary hugely between crops. I mean, some crops have no relevance to bees whatsoever. If you think of cabbage or leafy greens, that's a crop that you're harvesting before bloom. A grower would never have bees on site on purpose. But something like a squash or melon producer might rely on bees heavily. They may have bees there all summer for pollination purposes. Fruit and vegetables, some of those producers use bees a little bit too. Pepper producers in Maryland, Eastern Shore, and squash producers over there will rent bumblebees actually instead of honeybees. All of this is just to say you can get very widely varying responses to this, and that is totally okay. That's open why we're asking. And as we go through these tactics, again, we're asking if they're doing it always, sometimes, never. And then for the second one, this is again an intent question. Are they doing this practice to protect bees? And it's fine if they're not. Sometimes growers may be doing some of these practices for another reason altogether, and bees just benefit incidentally. But column 2 is that intent. So we're going to ask about bloom time applications. They're, again, for some crops that won't even apply. Asking about making applications below a temperature threshold. In some areas of the country, that's relevant. In some areas of the country, like the South, it never gets below 50 degrees in the growing season. Maintaining buffers between your farm and beehive locations. Selecting low-toxicity pesticides. Maybe considering an alternative application method. A lot of growers may opt to do a soil or chemigation application instead of a foliar spray if they're worried about hitting the bees. Avoiding applications when dew is forecast because that can result in a toxic residue level on the surface of the leaf for an extended period of time that the bees can come in and foraging for water. So avoiding that, avoid that exposure pathway. G is one you can kind of ignore. This is a remnant that made it through the orchard fruit chem survey, and we just forgot to delete it. In orchards, typically a grower could sometimes go through and mow off the orchard floor to eliminate blooming plants so that bees won't be as concentrated before they do spray. That may apply to some vegetable production, probably not, so I expect most people to say never to that, but it did stay in the survey. And then the other one is making applications at nighttime when bees are less likely to forage. So all these sorts of things, we're interested in what growers are aware of and what they're doing. And finally, we wanted to ask about independent certification programs, or could also be referred to auditing programs. The reason this is of interest is because this can really give EPA a lot of direct information because the auditing programs may already have requirements for IPM, the drift control or resistance management. So if they're certified global GAP, and EPA can say, wow, 82% of squash growers in the South are global GAP certified, that gives them confidence to say, okay, that means 82% of squash growers are doing practice XYZ because they need to do those things to qualify for the certification. So it's kind of it's a really good proxy measure for a lot of the same measures that we're asking about separately elsewhere in the survey. And that is it. That takes us to the end of this. We know that's a lot of questions. We know that this adds some burden for both the growers and the enumerators, and we're so appreciative of your willingness to help us with this. We think the information you collected last year for fruit and wheat was super helpful, and we're hoping that over time we're going to get better at this, have the questions better targeted, but ultimately this is a very valuable effort for OPMP, and we really appreciate massive assistance with getting us this information. And just recapping, we don't have to go through this again. I think by now you get the point of why we're asking about this. We want to understand what's happening on the ground, what sources of information growers are using, and how best we can reach growers to get them good information about all these practices. And with that, we're through this, and we are happy to take some questions or comments or answer any other concerns you may have.